Our New Testament reading this morning is from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 9, verses 2 through 9. It is in the New Testament portion of your Pew Bible on page 44. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. And his clothes became a dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, there was no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. This is the word of the Lord. Our biblical readings this morning present us with stories that invite a dialogue about the mystical element in our lives. In the Old Testament, we have a chariot of horses and of fire that seems to appear out of nowhere and separates Elijah from his friend before he is assumed into heaven by a whirlwind. People claim to have seen this happen. And then our New Testament reading has us pondering a picture of Jesus standing on a mountaintop, dazzling in the brightest white clothing that we can imagine, almost glowing, and appearing with 2 people who have long since passed away from this world. These texts are fantastic and frightening. They are inexplicable and surreal. They are difficult to understand and hard to ground in reality. These stories make us consider possibilities that we want to hope for and believe. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we turned the corner and there stood Jesus with 2 of his besties? Talk about relieving our doubts. I think that would do it. These stories demonstrate an encounter with the divine that we often find ourselves longing for in the deepest core of our being. When we pray for God to send us a sign, a sure sign, one that we cannot mistake for something else. But these stories also make us a little bit uncomfortable. They're hard to talk about, to describe, without sounding like we're a little crazy. We're worried what our friends and relatives might say if we were to recount a similar fantastic tale about our own faith. And there is part of us that wants to explain these stories away. We rationalize that they're not possible, that they're not logical. And we decide that these otherworldly stories sound much better when interpreted by the comfort of our own sophisticated terms. Terms like metaphor and symbolism and genre. See, we're caught in between worlds. The one that we proclaim is possible, and the one in which we already live. These texts, these stories, they assault our senses. They make us question our maturity. They make us feel uncertain about how it is we know things. Is it because we see them? Or because we hear them? Or because we believe them? They ask hard questions of us, like, do we really believe that we can experience moments of transformation and grace and resurrection in this world that we live in? Can Christ really break into our lives at any moment? How do we make meaning of these stories? I agree with minister and theologian Bruce G. Epperly that if we perceive these stories as nothing more than fairy tales, nothing more than simple metaphors, or nothing more than invitations into a deeper spiritual experience, then they deserve little to none of our attention. In other words, when we try to contain them in terms that make us more comfortable, then we miss the opportunity to take them seriously. And I think that they are written. I think they are read. I think they are told so that we will, in fact, take them seriously. Elijah and Moses had real histories and real meaning for the Hebrew people. For Jesus to appear with them, and for Peter and James and John to recognize them, despite the fact that they weren't wearing name tags or had identifiable profile pictures floating around out there on the web, I think that meant something. And while we don't necessarily have to view these stories as actual historical events that transpired, we can recognize that they point to the very real and dramatic experiences of God's transformative and transfiguring presence in this world. Did you know that the transfiguration of Jesus occurs smack dab in the middle of Mark's gospel? This strange and ethereal episode is at the very center, the heart, if you will, of Mark's good news. It carries with it details that might be easy to miss from our present-day experience. For instance, the scene itself recalls details from both Daniel and Exodus. In the Hebrew Bible, Daniel describes his own vision, saying, "I looked up and saw a man clothed in linen. His body was like beryl," which is a sparkling gemstone, "and his face was like lightning." In the book of Exodus, we read, "Then Moses went up a mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days." It goes on to say that God called out to Moses from the cloud. The author of Mark also employs this formula of 6 days and a cloud to clue his readers in that something big is about to happen here. He writes, 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them on a high mountain apart by themselves, going on to say, a cloud overshadowed them. And from the cloud there came a voice. Mark is sure to tell us that this is 6 days later. And so I want to know, Later than what? What happened 6 days earlier? Well, according to the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' first prediction that he would suffer and be rejected and killed before he would rise again. 6 days earlier, and Peter was rebuked by Jesus for his unwillingness to accept the idea that the Son of Man would undergo all of this heartache and pain. Get thee behind me, Satan. 6 days prior to our reading in the Gospel of Mark, we learned that the role of the Messiah was going to be very different than what we had hoped it would be. Up until that point, we, like the disciples, hoped that the Messiah would come in glory and reign over all in a very real sense, like a king or an emperor would. We hoped that justice would trickle down from a golden throne where a real man was seated and would travel by the law of the land. We thought that all those who aligned themselves with Jesus would still be considered among his top advisors and confidants, and that they too would receive glory and honor. We, like the disciples, had hoped that the coming of the Messiah would lessen the difficult times in which we lived. We thought we would be able to overcome anything. We thought that the Messiah was going to make everything right with the world. 6 days earlier, and we had refused to see the possibility that God's kingdom might come in a way that we did not understand, and with it, it would bring pain and suffering and death. And now it's 6 days later, and we're still not sure we want to believe it's true. The author of Mark is setting us up from the setting of this scene on a mountain set apart, incidentally, the only mountaintop story in the Gospel of Mark, to the recollection of the Hebrew Scriptures, to the centrality of this story and its location within the gospel itself, the only gospel that existed at the time, to the formula of 6 significant days and a cloud, the author of Mark expects to have his readers' attention. This is really important. Don't miss it. This is where the magic happens. This is where Mark reveals his secret. Transfiguration is at the heart of the good news. Other translations read, Jesus was transformed before them. Transfigured, transformed, either way. But the Greek metamorphothe means more than just changed in form. It also carries with it the connotation that this is an inward change that is outwardly visible. The Gospel according to Mark is unique in that it has no other resurrection appearances of Jesus. Now, this has bothered many. So much so that we have later additions to the Gospel of Mark that do have us encountering the resurrected Jesus. But most scholars believe that the Transfiguration text is essentially the only glimpse of resurrection we have in the Gospel of Mark. The Transfiguration text allows us to see this thin space where time and history are not rejected, but transfigured into God's new reality, a new heavens and a new earth right here in this world. And a tension exists. A tension between cross and resurrection that is the very center point of Mark's gospel, the fulcrum around which all that has come before and all that comes after will hinge. Now I need a deep breath. And so might you, because this is deep. And like Peter, I find myself bumbling around in the weight of these ideas and the heaviness of these stories. We have been up this mountain, and now we must come down. And I still find myself asking, so what does this mean? How does it relate to our faith? How does this have meaning for us? And I don't want to make the same mistakes as Peter. I am cautious not to ruin this moment by proclaiming its goodness. I am careful not to dissect this mountaintop experience into 3 points and a poem so that we have something to carry with us this week. I feel the tension between saying too much and not saying enough. And it's a real tension, one I think that we often run from. We want to stammer away at it with words and ideas and plans to make it be so. And again, like Peter, I want to build a structure with which to hold this wisdom that cannot be contained. And I feel the anxiety. And I read the next line. Then a cloud overshadowed them. And from the cloud there came a voice. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. And then all is quiet. And the moment is gone. And the visions are gone. And the dazzling light is gone. And there is only Jesus. Listen to him. Now is not the time for words or plans or designs. Now is the time for listening. And that requires that we use all our ways of knowing. Sight, sound, smell, touch, taste. Because when we listen, we don't just hear a sound. We make meaning of it. One of the most innovative percussionists of our time is a woman named Evelyn Glennie. She's from Scotland. She is also profoundly deaf. She insists that music is something she feels through rhythms and vibrations, just like the rest of us. She says deafness does not mean that you can't hear, only that there is something wrong with the ears. Author Mark Nepo, in his book, 7,000 Ways to Listen, suggests that perhaps our want to separate and pull apart that which we don't understand is our spiritual disability. He goes on to say that the art of listening may be to gather meaning from all of the senses rather than to isolate and analyze what we think at any one given moment. Poor Peter, rebuked by Jesus just 6 days earlier, and now seemingly rebuked by God, told to be quiet and listen. Poor Peter. He's just like us. And Mark presents us with a paradox. In our rush for words and symbols and understanding, we often run from feeling. And yet, perhaps it is only through our experience and feeling that we can understand the depth of life. Peter's and the others' disciples' experience of the transfiguration of Jesus may have been the most beautiful and devastatingly real event of their lives. Upon encountering the divine in fantastic visions that we cannot understand, much less explain, is the realization that what is really at stake here is not if it really happened, or if it was only a dream, or what they really saw, but in the knowing that because of it, we cannot remain the same. The transfiguration of Jesus happened not just to Jesus. It also happened to the disciples. It happened to you. It happened to me. It happened to us. And recognizing that requires a new way of being, a change in form from the inside, a transfiguration of our own. Amen.